Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to have you here. I simply want to start by asking you both what you think about the form of writing that the 2040 Prize offers to writers and encourages. The short novel and the succinct non-fiction piece. What makes 20 to 40,000 words an interesting or even exciting form to work in? Or do you think the word limit creates an artificial and unnecessary boundary that it would be better just to get rid of? I mean, are we being crazy doing this? Or is it actually a useful lever in the literary world?
It is actually very useful. I mean, and novellas have evolved as a form because they do serve a purpose. With a short story, you can only aim for a sort of a glancing effect or an impression, whereas a novel, it needs more than one thread. It normally has a main thread and several sub-threads, and there's always the risk of it becoming bloated. With a novella would usually only have one thread, so it sort of almost enforces a sort of certain succinctness, and I find it's got a sort of a purity of as well, a sort of purity of line, which can be very satisfying.
You'd think with the supposed short attention span that we have nowadays, that novellas and even short stories would be more popular. And I think novellas are going through or short novels are going through a renaissance, but the short story seems to be suffering for some reason. And maybe the short stories, you have to go into a story and then it's gone. A novel, it's a big commitment. Maybe the novella is this lovely sweet spot where you get to engage with something deeper, but it doesn't commit you for 3 weeks or whatever. Okay, what about you? Because of course you've written novellas or short novels, and you also, in this case, have tried your hand at a short fiction, non-fiction piece. What's your take on it all?
The difference for me with writing non-fiction in the shorter form is that if a publisher had said to me, "Oh, look, it'd be great if you could, write a memoir about your anxiety, but it needs to be 60,000 words or 70,000 words," which is what, at a minimum, that's what a commercial publisher would expect. There's no way that I could write about myself for that length of time anyway. And that shorter form also lent itself to the framing that I use in it, which is this particular discrete experience that happens over 3 days. I couldn't dwell too long in spaces, going over the things that I needed to go over in my mind in order to try to get them right on the page. In other words, I don't think I would have written the memoir at all if I hadn't been able to write it in a shorter form.
Well, that's a wonderful incentive. I love that. Having that constraint makes you focus on what might engage the reader. We've all been in conversations with people who can't shut up about their own experience and go on and on because they're trying to find their way through their own experience and come to terms with it, and they need to share it. And that's part of friendship. We do those things, of
Yeah,
course. But when you're trying to engage an audience and help them understand something you think is salient about the world that has to do with your experience, perhaps that constraint was unlocked something for you, which if that
absolutely.
yeah,
It,
that's
it, it definitely gave me a freedom to imaginatively engage with my wondering, because of course in my memoir, it's not a self-help book or anything. It's like a series of questions about anxiety and what it is and how I respond to it. So it enabled me to kind of ride those thought waves as well in quick succession.
Yeah, so just briefly, I mean, I'm not one for there being rules of writing. I don't think there should really be rules, but if there is one, I think one should strive for brevity where possible. The novella sort of encourages that. It encourages you to cut out everything that's not essential.
yes, and I couldn't agree with you more, Angus. Although I'd be loath to get rid of all Byzantine, embellishments of some writers, extraordinary lengths that they go to.
No, no, it doesn't apply to all writers.
Yeah,
There are
indeed.
you've got to be pretty good though.
Yes, exactly. This perspective you've given so far is great. Thank you. And it makes it seem that 2040 actually has a role in the world, which is lovely, even no matter how small that is. But in very different ways, you've both taken leaps of imagination to reach beyond your own experience in writing these two books. Kim, firstly going to you, you've stepped beyond your own experience, intense though that has been, to try to understand the nature of anxiety itself and how it has affected the lives of people you know. And Angus, you're not, a 14 or 15-year-old girl, yet you've attempted to create this eternal life. So, first with you, Kim, was trying to bridge these gaps actually the challenge that made writing these books worth the chase, or was it a difficult thing to massage everything to step beyond yourself in these ways?
I think engaging with the anxiety of others is intrinsic to my question of what anxiety is. If I'd written a memoir only about my own experiences of anxiety, and in fact, the first draft of it was very much focused on my own experience and probably too intensely. What I had wanted to ask really is where does, and again, without definitively answering it in any way, but more pondering it, where does anxiety come from in me? And where does anxiety sit in amongst us generally? There are so many layers to it, from climate anxiety to the anxiety that we feel about all the war in the world at the moment. So there's that circumstantial anxiety. But for people who live with anxiety, and I have since I was about 15, and I had my first recognizable grown-up panic attack, what triggers it? Why does somebody who is, reasonably competent in most areas of my life, why does this thing keep getting at me? I can't define precisely what it is. And I think that if you look at the way the medical profession engages with anxiety itself, and the way drug therapies are very hit and miss, there's a question, there's a medical question too, if people care to admit it, of not really knowing what this beast is. And that took me down the road of looking at the way that anxiety has manifested in particularly different family members. So my father is somebody who I would describe as having been pretty much functionally unwell for my entire life, sometimes amusingly so, and sometimes very horribly so. My mother was also an anxious person, but in a shut down way, in a much more concealed way. My maternal grandmother was somebody whose anxiety was much more obvious to me growing up. I think I say in the memoir that the engine inside her never shut down. I could hear it. I could hear her stomach moving as my head lay on her lap, and things like that. And then there's also the inheritances of trauma in the family as well. And none of that trauma is particularly spectacular. It's pretty much attached to experiences of poverty and bigotry that are quite common in themselves. But the way that I can see those inheritances of having been handed down to me, it was important for me to try to pin those shadows to the page, to say, I can't say precisely what this is, but I can acknowledge that this thing is. And I can open it out for others to see and respond to however they will, to kind of normalize the conversation, I guess, being more honest about our experiences of disconnection and psychic distress or whatever it is, and being kinder, not just with ourselves, but with each other, is where I want that conversation to go ultimately.
I think the thing there that you've identified is that we don't have to go through dramatic, searing trauma for life experience to make us anxious. And that's the point, that in a sense that life has enough challenges, whatever they are, the neuroses, the difficulties, the unsaid things, the unacknowledged things, the unexpressed things, create tension in our lives that's hard to come to terms with. The interesting thing, by contrast, of course, with your book, Angus, is that Anna is, 14 or 15-year-old girl in a situation that is directly traumatic. And she's had to deal with that by being older than her age and looking after young children. And now in the center of the story, she's on a trek for survival. And this is not your experience, obviously. So bridging this imaginative gap, was that the challenge that made the chase?
Yeah. bridging the gap. I mean, I think to me, that's actually the essence of fiction, is to imagine what it's like to be somebody else. And in the process, invite your readers to imagine what it's like to be someone else. This is probably the first time I've written about something that's actually so outside of my experience. Mostly I write about much more domestic stuff and recognizably come from what I've experienced. The reason I chose this subject was the germ of it was just from somebody's story that I'd heard who was in one of these camps. It bears absolutely no relation, other than that, it bears no relation whatsoever to their actual story. It evolved in my mind to become what it's since become. The reason I write something is because I'm interested in it. And I was just interested in this, and it held my interest. And it went through lots of incarnations, this little story. It could have become all sorts of things, but it settled on what it is.
So, Angus, how much was that germ of the story of someone you knew leaving, I think it was a Russian camp,
Mm.
trekking to safety? How much did, whether, obviously it's not the story itself, but how much do you think the way they made that experience kind of live for you engendered your imagination to create it in your own way?
It certainly engendered my imagination when I first heard the person's story. It sort of boiled away in the back of my mind for quite some time, for maybe years, before I decided to actually do something about it. It sounds sort of a bit cold to say this, but it was almost like a writing exercise for me to just find some part of it here and engage with it and go through with it and try and produce something. A lot of it did grow quite sort of organically. For instance, when she meets up with the guard again during the trek, and I was sort of really looking forward to it because I was wondering what was going to happen, and I just didn't really know how they were going to interact, and it was quite, it was quite interesting just seeing it all pan out. Even
That's such an interesting observation, Angus, because some writers, and often writers who are more commercial, plan a book from beginning to end. Whereas I think imaginative fiction, you're on a voyage yourself.
Yeah, yes, and not saying I didn't know what was going to happen. I sort of did, but I didn't know how it was going to happen. I didn't know how I was going to write it. But the fact that I was anticipating it so much made it really interesting and almost, dare I say it, enjoyable. To have a writing session, sitting there with a blank piece of paper and knowing that I had something to write, which was going to have an unexpected result. Because so often you sit down, it's quite tough forcing yourself to sit down and write. I'm sure most writers have that.
It's interesting, Patrick Wise was famous for saying that writing was like picking at old scabs. And I've always been a little bit skeptical, even though I've for all my life enjoyed Patrick White's writing. I've always thought he was a bit self-dramatizing in terms of the way he talked about his own writing, because I think inevitably the hard work, in inverted commas, of writing has to be engendered by a joy of trying to do it. And I think you described that really well. You anticipated it, but you knew it wouldn't be easy, which is why we bother, perhaps.
He described, I think he described first drafts as being like a difficult forceps birth, and I relate to that.
Yes, yes, indeed. So Kim, touched your wonderful memoir is framed around a 3-day panic attack you experienced, but the narrative surrounds and weaves through this personal experience. It's not just linear. I know you've done a lot of academic research and writing, but as an experienced fiction writer, was it a very different experience engaging with the kind of creative nonfiction thinking involved in writing a memoir? Or were there interesting synergies or connections or similarities?
Well, kind of yes and no. It sounds ridiculous to say this, but because I am a book editor, I have edited numerous memoirs. I intrinsically know that the skills of fiction need to be brought to creative nonfiction. I know this, but for whatever reason, when it has come to writing about myself beyond a tiny blog post, I get caught up on the truth. what's true, and that slipperiness of the truth, knowing that today's truth is not necessarily going to be tomorrow's truth or the truth in 5 years' time. Our memories shift around, but also our emphasis on this and that, shifts around. Reminding myself of those skills of fiction and freeing myself up from the truth by making that simple statement at the beginning of the memoir that this is impressionistic truth. It's the truth as I remember it from a particular slice of time, that 3-day panic attack. And because I was so incredibly hypervigilant across those 3 days, as anybody who has experienced that kind of anxiety will know what I mean by hypervigilance. I remember what people were wearing. I remember what people were saying. I remember the texture of things so vividly. And in that sense, that particular experience wrote itself. I didn't have to think too hard about what the truth was because it's kind of smashed into my brain through that process of anxiety. So that 3-day framework was just kind of a gift, was there, but it also gave me the question along which to pin everything else. And that is, why does this thing happen to me? My particular danger zone is when something really good happens. And a couple of really good things happened that triggered that particular anxiety attack. And that was, I was graduating from my master's. I had just won the inaugural Finlay Lloyd 2040 prize for Ladies Rest and Writing Room. And I'd also won an academic prize. I should have been riding high and just enjoying the moment, enjoying, going off to Sydney and experiencing graduation. But no, that's not the way it works for me. It's almost as if something really good happens and self-doubts crowd in a almost unbearably unstoppable way. And every bad thought that I've ever had about myself smashes into me, and I don't deserve this award, and this is imposter syndrome, to the max. I know that this will chime with many people, particularly women, that you find excuses or find reasons that this thing that you've been given and this thing that you've earned is not really quite yours. You've fluked it. You've not quite earned it, or what have you. It's just, it's absolutely insane.
So interesting, Kim. It's almost as though alertness makes you more, I mean, the extremity of situation makes you more alert to experience. And it also seems as though your self-doubt is a psychic need to balance the universe, that you can't have too much good. So you need to return to doubt and self-questioning to keep things stable in some
That's a very nice way of putting it.
weird way of, well, I'm joking, but I don't.
Well, that balance between chaos and that sense of peace, that elusive sense of peace, is very much a theme throughout the whole memoir, because it's very much front of mind all the time for me. That tension that we all have inside us of this kind of, the chaos of the internal multi-log going around in our heads all the time, no matter whether we're, anxious about anything or not. And this desire for peace, and the way that, peace for me isn't necessarily, sort of going for a walk in the paddock and listening to the birds. Sometimes even peace itself can be a dangerous point for me, because I'm craving the stillness so much that I have ideations that aren't particularly pleasant or helpful.
Yes, no matter what your circumstance, intrusive negative thoughts tend to crowd our minds at times. It's such an interesting thing. And of course, I don't mean to make light of your experience. It must be deeply disturbing, but you have such perspective on it, which is an interesting.
Yes, I thought to knit all that into this coherent little work was extraordinarily skillful. and you've balanced all the different aspects of it. There are so many different things going on there, from little philosophical speculations to your family tree, and then what was actually going on during those 3 days. And it all came together really beautifully.
Thank you.
That's lovely, Angus. Thank you for commenting in such a lovely way about Kim's writing. Of course, in your book, the extremity of Anna's situation is intense at that moment. And you took that moment of her trek as the center of your short novel. But that's the selection of narrative. After all, the story might have taken her to some further resolution a little bit later, or even into adulthood, or even become a saga that carried her to old age. So, was your circumscribed slice exactly the shape for the narrative that you wanted, or was it partly determined by the 2040 word count?
Well, it was certainly the process of quite a lot of trial and error. So I wrote quite a lot that I never ended up using, and I had several ideas that I wrote or started writing that I put aside. And then when I'd settled on this sort of arc of this story from Anna's, it was a journey from victimhood to self-possession, essentially, that naturally lent itself to the 2040. I mean, it was always going to be a novella to me. That was the length it was going to have to be.
It's an interesting question because, of course, often in romantic fiction, some sort of deep resolution that carries, the end of War and Peace, everyone's playing with toys and everyone has children, everyone's together, and nearly everyone has survived the Napoleonic Wars. And the reader leaves this extraordinary, expansive story with a sense that life has been fulfilled. Of course, your book has a very different focus and purpose. And did you have trouble reaching a resolution of how you would end the story? And I'm not asking you to give away to the reader what you did, but was that a difficult thing to actually decide?
Yes, it was difficult. My original version of the actual Anna story, had a completely different ending. But it also had a different ending when I originally sent it to Finlay Lloyd, to the 2040. And as you know, during the process of editing, we made some quite big tweaks both at the beginning and the end, and we produced something that just worked much better. And in a way, the process of editing, you helped me to actually see what the story really was, and I perhaps hadn't been 100% sure before that. I know it's a very intense process, your editing process, which I don't think any other publishing houses would provide. I think it actually, I wouldn't say maybe not radically changed the story, but it just shaped it properly. It just turned it into something. There was something there that had potential before, and I think you must have seen the potential in it. We managed to realize that potential.
Well, it's wonderful,
Yes.
wonderful you feel that because, of course, an editor's anxiety, coming back to that wonderful word anxiety, is that intervening, you actually distort what the writer is trying to do. And I love trying to avoid that and help the writer realize the best version of their book that they can. So thank you. I'm glad you feel that. That salves my conscience a little bit. So Kim, going back to your experience of writing this book, I mean, you've talked about the process of navigating your way through your experience and how it enabled you not to self-indulgently navel gaze too much. But was being forthright about your experience and the experience of those around you a difficult tussle, either emotionally or even ethically?
Yeah, absolutely. A big ethical question. Very first novella that I ever wrote was a novella called Wild Chicory, based on my relationship with my grandmother, who I speak quite a lot about in the memoir. In that novella, I changed names, I changed locations, I changed everything. And I was very much hiding behind fiction in order to explore that particular significant relationship. When it came to the memoir, I did a similar thing in the sense that I took all the names out of it. So my grandmother is just, Nin. Mum is just mum. Dad is just dad. My brother is my brother. I don't name any of my friends in it. And I make very clear at the beginning that that's what I'm doing. that this is my truth, and I don't want my truth to encroach in any negative way upon anyone else's. So before I even set out to do this, there was that rule in my head, almost like the Hippocratic Oath of do no harm except to myself, in terms of self-revelation. I didn't want to expose anybody else's influence on me in any terrible, negative way. Obviously, I discuss my relationship with my parents, and I show that there is that negativity, but I tried to do it with love. That was part of the, not so much an ethical constraint, but a determination to try to tell as whole a truth as possible, an acknowledgement that this is my truth. Other people have different perspectives.
Yes, no, I love that, particularly in a world where it's so polarized that people are very unforgiving of each other's place in the world. And I think that's one of the beauties of being a reflective writer, that you can allow space for other people's existence, and you do that generously. But you also, I think, you talk about everyone's truth, but I love the way you rounded that off by saying that that was an attempt to get a wholer version of the truth by respecting the fact that yours is a limited version of it. So I think that's a lovely perspective. By contrast, Angus, Anna's journey is in a world that, of course, is bare and stripped back and ruthless and hard. Obviously, the time and place for Anna is left relatively vaguely defined. It feels as though it's last century, perhaps, or early mid last century. Obviously, this avoids the narrative being pinned down by associations that are too loaded with historical detail, and I think that's something you wanted to avoid. But I think there's also a virtue in the suggestive doubt that hovers over the reality of the world Anna actually travels through. Was it important to you to establish this tension, actually as a tension between the very real sense of Anna's struggle to survive in a physically real world and the somewhat shadowy nature of that world at the same time?
I suppose I felt that getting into the intensity of Anna's actual experience, she would be seeing the world outside of her as somewhat shadowy because she's intensely focused on what's going on inside her, just the day-to-day struggle to survive. Any sort of historical detail would be sort of rather irrelevant to her. Another thing I wanted, I'm not sure whether I wanted this in the first place or whether it just evolved, was a sort of a fable-like aspect to it, and something to make it, to sort of universalize it. Again, not being too specific on details that I didn't really need. It sort of makes the whole thing tend towards this sort of slight, sort of more universality. I'm trying to find a way of evoking Anna's experience, which to me seems to be surreal, hyperreal, but not really, not actually, not quite real. And that somehow lends itself to this sort of universality, which is, I think, what I'm ultimately striving for here. I'm striving to say something that is applicable into other circumstances. I'm not actually trying to write a historical novel with all the details correct.
It's interesting, Angus, because we've all read historical novels where the author desperately signals their research all the time, and it can be a terrible problem for writing. The beauty of what you do is that the setting is vague, the particularity of Anna's experience is very real. I think that.
Can I butt in?
Yes, please do.
One of the things that I love about Anna is that it is devoid of cliche because of the way that you've approached it in that fable-like and universal way. As Julian just pointed out, we've all read those historical fictions that are very heavy-handed, particularly in talking about historical trauma and people's experience of brutality at the hands of whatever regime. And they can fall into patterns of cliche or tropes in themselves. And there's no particular trope that you could pin on Anna. I just love that about Anna, that you have made not only that story universal in a way, but a new reading of that particular experience of brutality.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kim. I was trying to imagine the intensity of her experience, and if everyone's experience is original, if you can imagine it that way, then it'll hopefully will come out not being cliched.
Yes, that's lovely. And it's because partly, I think, Angus, because of your determination to go on the voyage with Anna and experience what she would have experienced rather than having some set ideological notion that you wanted to demonstrate through a cardboard cutout. I think that's really, really valuable and what makes the story searingly real. So to finish off, Angus, you've already talked a little bit about this, the editing process, and you may want to add something. The 2040 Prize offers an opportunity for us to help writers find the best version of their book, as I've already mentioned. But Kim, you've been through this twice with me, so good on you for being so brave. But as a previous winner of the fiction prize and now the nonfiction one, how do you feel about the process of being edited in an intense way? And I'm not just asking you to say nice things. I'm actually interested in how it felt for you mechanically.
Unfortunately, I'm going to say a bunch of nice things, whether you like it or not. You are my favourite editor. And as Angus alluded to earlier, the editorial process in commercial publishing is often wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. It's sort of, next cab off the rank. So from my perspective as a book editor, I'm lucky to get 2 or 3 weeks with a manuscript and it's gone. With you, it is a genuine conversation. I felt that even though the 2 different projects I've worked with you on are very different, I felt the same depth of engagement, the same depth of your desire to make this story the best story it can be. And that's what I mean when I say, I feel like you're on my side. You want this book to work. And I would never normally do this, but you got the first draft. And it was just a matter of timing. The deadline for the prize was coming up and I thought, I don't have time to do a proper second draft of this. I was in part still speaking to myself too much and speaking to a very small audience in my head. It wasn't as outward facing as it could possibly be. And you also encouraged me to include more of my family history, which in the first draft I'd only just sort of hinted at. I put in some signposts there that were meaningful to me, but didn't really say anything to the reader. And I will always be grateful that you led me down that path, not only because I think it reads better, it's a much fuller document of what I had to say because of your editorial input. So thank you.
Well, thank you. That's wonderful, Kim. And I mean, the basic thing here is when you get a book that you can see how valuable it is, you want it to realize that potential that's evident in it. And we all, I mean, I imagine you both have read things where you wish someone had helped the writer realize what you thought was wonderful about the book, but there were things that you think failed. And trying to minimize those failures and maximize the things that realize themselves fully is the whole art, isn't it? And you know that from being an editor, Kim. And Angus, do you have anything to add about that story?
After what Kim's just said, I wish I could say that what I'd sent you originally was also my first draft, but it was actually wasn't. It was something that I thought was finished, done and dusted, and I hadn't actually looked at it for maybe 3 years. When I came to look at it again at the beginning of the editing process, I have to say I was actually appalled. I thought, my God, the writing is all over the place. Did I really write this, or did I really think this was finished? This is ridiculous. But then you sort of talked me through it, told me how it was all going to work, and we started the process. And one of the first things you said was, "Can we improve the beginning? Can we do something about the beginning?" And I thought, yes, of course we can, yes. And I very quickly managed to come up with something much better, which I was actually pleased with, which made sense on all sorts of levels, which it hadn't before. And I think I was able to do that because the very fact that we'd started this process gave me confidence, because you know, you wouldn't have chosen this piece of work if you hadn't had some sort of faith in it, that we could actually produce something better. And I could hardly believe that somebody was actually spending this amount of time on this piece of work. Again, that's a sort of shows how much you cared about it. So I am very grateful for that. And I don't think I didn't accept all of your suggestions, but I always thought hard about them and tried to understand where you were coming from. And I think we come up with something that has sort of reached a nice fruition. I think we're very lucky to be part of this process, where you're actually doing it the old-fashioned way, and you're producing books that are really lovely things to touch and to look at. I really feel very fortunate. So thank you.
Well, that's lovely, Angus. Thank you so much. And we do really care about the physical object. Thank you for showing that process of being through finishing your book and making it a reality, for appreciating that. That's wonderful. Both of you have commented on the support you've got from Finlay Lloyd in creating your books. One of the interesting things about the process, of course, is that there's a panel of wonderful people who give their time to read and choose the books that we're going to publish. And interestingly enough, the questions you have had about your books were reflected in the panel. We had quite a lot of discussion about which books we should choose to publish this year. The wonderful thing that came out of it was, even though there were questions about how your books could be improved, the panel saw the virtue, the great virtue that was in them, that they admittedly thought needed work. But that's part of the process too, of having a publishing prize, that we can actually take the wonderful thing that your books were and turn them into something that's even more developed. So thank you again both for being here and sharing your thoughts about your wonderful books. And I look forward to seeing you as we go through the process of the books going out into the world. And goodbye for now.
Thank you, Julian, for everything.
Thank you very much, Julian.